The Bowery Boys episode 488, Party Like It's 76.
Hey, it's the Bowery Boys.
Hey.
Hi there, welcome to the Bowery Boys. This is Greg Young.
And this is Tom Myers, and wow, Greg, what a festive time.
Yes, it is.
Right now in New York City, we are just a couple of weeks away from a very major, once-in-a-lifetime anniversary on July 4th, 2026.
Yes, that would be the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States and the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Huzzah!
Huzzah! So understandably, there is a lot out there to celebrate and explain in this particular moment. It is a subject that is very important to us as a New York City history podcast, but we thought that we might approach it from a different angle. We thought that perhaps today on the show, we could celebrate celebrations.
Now, part of this has to do with New York's situation during 1776, because while many citizens did welcome the battle for America's independence, and many were gathered around George Washington and his men as the Declaration was read to them on the common grounds on July 9th, 1776, the result ultimately led to battles in August and September of that year, and then to the eventual capture of the city by British troops.
And side note, if you would like to transport yourself right back there to that period, to the summer of 1776, we would recommend downloading the fabulous new interactive app produced by the Gotham Center for New York City History. It is called Echoes of Revolution NYC. And it will take you on a 90-minute tour of Lower Manhattan past many of the spots that were so important to the American Revolution. It is super well done, so check that out. That is Echoes of Revolution NYC.
But on today's show, we're going to look at just how the nation, and New York specifically, of course, marked those big anniversaries of 1776 over time. So 1826 for the 50th, 1876 for the 100th, and so on, with special attention paid, of course, to a year that many of us actually remember, 1976, which was the 200th anniversary of the nation's birthday, and it was also a very fraught year in New York's history in the aftermath of a fiscal crisis. Okay, so the spirit of 76, as they used to say, came with a lot of subway graffiti and a disco beat.
Two fabulous things.
Yes.
But the summer of 1976 also saw a battalion of tall ships sail into New York Harbor to celebrate and really sort of centered the nation's bicentennial celebration around New York City and our harbor. And guess what? They are at it again. They're going to be doing it one more time this year in 2026, and it's going to be even bigger than it was in 76.
Exactly. So in the latter half of our show, we'll be speaking to Captain Jonathan Boulware, the CEO of South Street Seaport's museum, to chat about this year's celebration, which is called Sail Forth. We like a good pun. And to look at how the Seaport is getting involved in these festivities. But Tom, let's begin at the beginning, right?
Okay.
And that date, of course, is July 4th, 1776, Philadelphia. I was just down there for a few days. I just came back. You know, everything there is covered in patriotic bunting. There are patriotic reenactors everywhere.
You've been spending a lot of time there, by the way.
I have been cheating on New York City.
Should we be worried?
Well, it's just for research for my book, which, you know, I'm almost done. And I will be talking about 1,000,000 times on the podcast once it actually happens, but I'm researching it now. So I have this connection with Philly. But while I was there, I stood in the room where the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Second Continental Congress within Independence Hall. Now, today, that date, July 4th, 1776, is venerated worldwide. In fact, there were many tourists from different countries alongside me in that room asking questions while the park ranger was telling the story, because it's park rangers. It's a national park place. But this date obviously wasn't always celebrated, right? I mean, clearly. So when did it start picking up as a hallowed date in the country and in the city in particular?
Okay, well, first, let us flip forward 50 years from that origin date.
Right. That would be July 4th, 1826.
Exactly.
200 years ago.
Right. And just the year after the opening of the Erie Canal.
Yeah.
Which, as we know, and we talked about last year on the show, this city celebrated in a really big way.
They know how to celebrate back then, right? So did they also celebrate the 50th anniversary of July 4th, maybe in similar fashion?
They did, and they did it by throwing a really big party in a brand new, exciting location called the Washington Military Parade Ground.
I'm guessing Washington Square Park?
That's right.
Okay.
Colloquially just called Washington Square.
Right.
Starting in 1826. Remember, this had been a potter's field, but in 1826, it was converted into the Washington Military Parade Ground. And it officially opened as such on July 4th, 1826.
Oh, I didn't know. So its actual birthday, of the park, traces back to the start of the 50th anniversary. So it's part of the story. Wow.
And it was a day that it actually hosted a party. It was the city's, quote, Jubilee celebration. So this was kind of a two for the price of one celebration, right? You got a new park and you got this patriotic celebration. And the party sounds great. I mean, I found an article in the New York Evening Post from July 1st, 1826, listing out this day's activities. It started at 7 a.m. with a firing of a salute, and then the mayor was received at 2 p.m. The Declaration of Independence was read at 2:30, followed by a 3 o'clock feast that, in subsequent reporting, I found out, was attended by about 50,000 people, or roughly a third of the city's population at the time. The article reads, quote, 2 roasted oxen and other refreshments will be served up for the citizens and the military under an arbor, decorated in an appropriate manner for this glorious anniversary.
But 2 oxen doesn't seem like it's enough to feed 50,000 people.
Don't worry. It turns out that there were also 200 hams and many, many barrels of beer.
Too bad we weren't there. 2 more hams would have been there.
Well, 202 hams. And also parades. Parades, of course, there are regiments marching through the streets past City Hall. City Hall, which was, quote, ornamented with a transparent painting representing the Committee of Congress in the act of presenting the Declaration of Independence. So they were really in the mood, right? And it was all topped off, of course, by an evening of fireworks at City Hall. So
a good old-fashioned New York celebration, essentially, for the 50th anniversary. But it's a day that kind of gets forgotten. It would come to represent something else because of this very remarkable tragic coincidence, a sort of passing of the torch from leadership of not just one, but 2 founding fathers who died that day.
Incredibly, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, founding fathers and former presidents both, died on July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary.
This is just one of those truly stranger than fiction type facts that you learn in your early days of American history learning. Because Jefferson was 83, Adams was 90, so they were up there in age.
And reportedly, John Adams' last words on his deathbed were, Thomas Jefferson still survives. He didn't know that Thomas Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. It's just an incredible coincidence. It is noted, obviously, by everybody, but I think that it was felt by many as a sign that a page was turning, right? That this founding generation had done their job well, and now it was time for a new generation to take over.
So, but back to these celebrations, because there were larger celebrations in Philadelphia at this time, but New York was relatively muted.
And that fact should not really be all that, surprising, because independence, the whole independence movement, the writing, all of this, the debating took place down there, right? New York, remember during the war, had been the seat of British power.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1826, it was now the nation's largest port. It was becoming the nation's business capital, but it was not considered the sort of patriotic capital.
Sure, exactly. So then let's move to the next one, shall we? Let's jump ahead 50 more years. 1876. Now we are 100 years away from the signing. So could I gather that New York threw a larger party?
Well, kind of. I mean, New York was much larger
Sure.
in 1876. This was obviously the Gilded Age at this point, and the city had really expanded massively and moved up the island, as we have talked about exhaustively on this show.
And without a doubt, it was the business capital of the nation
Yes.
in 1876. So then where were these big celebrations? I assume they had moved beyond Washington Square.
They were in Philly. The nation's attention was once again focused on Philadelphia. In 1876, they threw a lavish World's Fair called the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. It was, this patriotic and capitalistic celebration of all that was great in the United States.
This was America's first major World's Fair. And I mean, we're hitting its anniversary also, which is kind of amazing. Nearly 10 million people went to this. And we also saw the debut of many interesting items. Maybe the best known, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone was there among many other marvels.
Well, and also at the show was the Statue of Liberty's right arm and torch, which Bartholdi had shipped over in August of 1876 to help raise money and awareness for his big project. And then in late 1876, it moved the right arm and torch to New York, where it sat in Madison Square Park until 1882, allowing guests, of course, for many years to climb up inside and to gaze out over the neighborhood. And as I discussed in my recent show, Made in France, that's episode 474, about the French origins of the Statue of Liberty, Bartholdi did originally come to New York City 5 years earlier to find a spot for his statue. And his intention was to give it to the city as a gift to celebrate the Centennial. So he did want it to be done for the Centennial.
So New York could have had a massive celebration on July the 4th, 1876. But the statues, well, as statues of that size are rather hard to build and took longer to finance and construct.
Indeed. And she would actually be unveiled in 1886, 10 years later. And one other attraction that's worth mentioning is the charming Swedish Cottage, which sits in Central Park today and is home to the Marionette Theater. That was also a part of Philly's Centennial Exposition. And then it moved to Central Park after the expo the next year in 1877.
Wow. So a little bit of that in Central Park that we can visit today, this summer.
Right.
We should. So a lot was going on then in Philadelphia, but let's then jump one more time into the future here, 50 more years to 1926. Now, what do we know about the 150th celebration? Was that a little more subdued?
You mean the sesquicentennial, Greg?
Yes.
Everybody's favorite spelling bee word?
Of course.
Quick. Well, the sesquicentennial was still focused, really, down on Philadelphia. And they did hold another international expo. Although the 1926 expo did not have the success of the 1876.
I mean, I think famously, it's known for having the worst weather of any outdoor event, perhaps in American history. That was open for 184 days and it rained 107 days.
Yeah. It lost a lot of money. But it was also still the big thing that was happening in the country to celebrate the 150th. New York just didn't have anything like that. Governor Al Smith proclaimed an Independence Week and encouraged towns and cities all over the state to hold events, and concerts and parades and to sort of celebrate the idea of independence. But all of this was very localized.
And, not for nothing, July the 4th, 1926 also was pretty subdued because it was a Sunday in 1920s.
That's right. The official celebrations took place the next day, on July 5th. The 4th, according to the Daily News, quote, was subdued by regard for the Sabbath, save for the occasional bang by an impatient child. But on the 5th, quote, throughout the 5 boroughs at parks and halls, bands will blare today and speakers will spellbind in 100 patriotic observations.
Honestly, I wonder if the city was really that quiet. I have my doubts.
Yeah, I do too, because right underneath that article was another one about how 1 million New Yorkers, quote, flocked to beaches jamming all transit lines the day before on the 4th. So they were not clearly all in church.
Right.
And by the way, at Coney Island, I was reading that a Miss Yeda Kernan had to be taken to the hospital with a fractured leg, and scores of people were, quote, trampled and bruised when about a third of the 450,000 people at Coney Island followed the course of an advertising airplane up and down the boardwalk in a mad scramble for candy samples, which were attached to small parachutes.
What?
There was candy raining down with small parachutes from an airplane over the boardwalk in Coney Island.
I am so happy to leave that patriotic centennial tradition in the past. Could you imagine the modern boardwalk if someone was like strewing Snicker bars everywhere?
I can. Yes, I can imagine that. But yes, I think what you're getting at is that this is starting to sound a little bit more like the city that we know today.
Yeah.
But bigger picture here, the nation's eyes did not really turn to New York,
right?
Okay, for this big 150th celebration. And yet at the same time, by 1926, the city's power and its status had actually never been greater. And New York now, by that point, was without question the nation's cultural, media, and economic capital.
And let's just remember the roots of New York City here. The city was built due to its prominence in the 19th century shipping trades. Remember, that's how New York was formed. In so many ways, that financial might that New York would hold, continues to hold, was born out of its connection to trade and the water, both through the interior of the United States via the Erie Canal and other methods, but more prominently with international trade.
Yeah, thousands and thousands of ships arrived into New York Harbor, and at least, in the early 19th century, principally docked along the east side, where their cargo was then delivered into warehouses and then distributed out into the rest of the city, and really then off to the rest of the country.
Now, once the railroad arrives as part of this transportation and delivery system that it connects to, some of that shipping migrates over to Manhattan's west side, but it's really along the east side here, from the tip of Manhattan up to Corlear's Hook, that New York becomes the shipping mecca, right? Mostly clipper ships and windjammers. Ships that are powered by the wind, essentially, right? According to the recollections of one English visitor in 1846, quote, the city side of the East River is covered as far as the eye can catch with a forest of masts and rigging, as dense and tangled in appearance as a cedar's swamp, unquote.
So then to get us back to the 20th century, think about how, different ships have become, especially in the middle of the 20th century, mostly steam or engine powered. The heyday of the tall ships or rigged ships with top masts and topsails, that had almost entirely faded from view.
And among ship captains and maritime enthusiasts of the day, there was a real fear that the very sophisticated craft of operating these vessels, these tall ships, that all this knowledge would be lost.
So all the other ships were container ships, there were tankers, and none of them obviously were using wind power.
Right. So in the year 1961, coming in to save the day here were two men, Frank Brainerd of the American Merchant Marine Institute and Niels Hansel, who worked for IBM. So they came up with this idea to bring tall ships in New York Harbor in a parade, just kind of celebrates the majesty of tall ships, right? Of course, they needed federal permission to sweep an armada into a major harbor. You can't just collect ships and insert them into a city like that. Fortunately for them, we happen to have a U.S. president who loved seeing these ships upon the water, and somebody who, could bump up this special cause to a national prominence.
A mid-20th century president with nautical interests, almost perhaps plucked from a magazine ad for nautical wear.
Yeah.
Boat leisure wear. That could be none other than John F. Kennedy.
Right.
He was famously a big sailor. He was even in the U.S. Naval Reserve in his early years.
He even collected ship models in bottles.
I love
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Very easy to picture on a sailboat wearing a captain's hat, scarf around the neck, right? I was even digging through some vintage issues of Motorboating magazine, as one does for research. And I found a quote about him from 1963. Quote, "The chief executive is all in favor of using old-fashioned sailing craft as naval training ships, believing crew discipline can be developed through the teamwork necessary to sail under canvas," unquote. And so, in 1963, he endorsed this organization, which then was called Operation Sail.
Operation Sail, or OpSail, is then the same organization that spearheads these massive ship parades, such as the one that we're going to be talking about that's taking place this year.
Right. Now, unfortunately, JFK did not live to see the first grand parade of ships, for he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. Several months later, on July 14th of 1964, New Yorkers then got to witness this extraordinary parade that they had all been dreaming of. And the parade was actually a tie-in, get this, to the New York World's Fair.
Out in Flushing Meadow.
Yes.
And so if this was part of the World's Fair, it must have been drawing more than just U.S. ships to this parade of ships.
Absolutely. According to the Operation Sail website, it was the largest peacetime gathering of sailing ships up to that point in the century. 12 Class A vessels, 11 Class B and C vessels, and thousands of spectator craft. To quote from the New York Daily News, "Not since the clipper ship era has such a spectacle been seen in New York Harbor."
Must have been wonderful to see. I mean, almost like ghosts from the past.
And this wasn't the only effort, of course, by maritime advocates to preserve and keep alive this waterfront tradition that was quite literally defined New York City, right? And it seemed to be disappearing. Well, with the context of Operation Sail in mind, it's no surprise to see people looking at our New York's old seaport and wondering what could be preserved. After all, downtown was now a forest of skyscrapers, not masts. And instead of a busy stream of cargo coming off these ships, you now have this incredibly unattractive FDR Drive that literally cut the waterfront off from the city.
Nothing is romantic to look at as an elevated highway.
Absolutely. So, in 1966, and inspired actually by the work that was going on in Connecticut at the Mystic Seaport.
Love
you've been
it.
there.
Yeah. I've been there with you.
Yes, we have. The organization Friends of South Street was formed and then very slowly began forming a museum and then assembling buildings that were in danger of being demolished, most notably the old counting houses on Fulton Street, known as Schermerhorn Row. Now, they began restoring a couple old ships as well as part of this project, the Wavertree and the lightship Ambrose, not to put them back into commission, but to permanently dock them on the waterfront for educational purposes.
And thus the South Street Seaport was born. And you can really then see how Operation Sail and the Seaport are linked, as they are linked in our guest who's going to be joining us in just a minute.
And ironically, perhaps, that they were having these maritime successes right at this very moment when New York Harbor, the actual harbor, the water, was probably at its absolute most polluted and poisonous up until this history, like literally poisonous.
Yeah, at least to the native sea life that once had flourished in the harbor. This is a fact that we learned last summer in our podcast about how New York had been the city of oysters, and which featured the Billion Oyster Project, which is a group that is attempting to return the harbor to its original natural state.
And I would say they're succeeding. The water is so much cleaner. Tom, there's dolphins and whales. It was just a whale this past weekend coming in. You know, we're getting all kinds of tourists these days.
Everybody is coming to New York.
Everyone. But in the 1960s, these types of sea creatures would have been choked and poisoned by the water. But help was very slowly on its way here, as in the 1970s, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed, and one part of its mission is to clean up the nation's waterways. If the water's good enough for the dolphins, it's good enough for us, and it's certainly good enough for the tall ships.
Yes, because more than a decade after that first grand procession sailed into the harbor for the 1964 World's Fair, Operation Sail was back, returning to New York City with an even larger parade of ships. But would New York City be in the mood to celebrate in 1976? We find the spirit of 1976, right after this. Okay, so Greg, we have arrived at the big one, the Bicentennial, July 4th, 1976. As we said earlier, a celebration that some of our listeners undoubtedly remember well.
And a celebration that arrived at a, needless to say, tricky time for not only the country, but very specifically for our city.
Well, actually, things had been pretty rocky since the 1960s. Quoting from an article that was written by Angelina Ambrose for the Gotham Center for New York City History, quote, "This was especially the case for New York City. Hit hard by the fiscal crisis, the 1970s in New York City were a time of distrust in the government, economic troubles, and high crime. In New York City and across the nation, bicentennial planning efforts therefore focused on celebration and unity, articulating a very particular narrative of the American past."
Now, on this note, I actually recorded a show last year about the famous 1975 Daily News headline, with Ford to City, drop dead. Okay, that's the vibe going on right now. Right. The city's financial situation was a disaster. It had lost around 600,000 jobs, nearly bankrupt. And when New York asked for federal help, President Ford refused.
Yeah, which resulted in that infamous Daily News headline from October 30th, 1975. But then, that December, he signed off on a loan program to keep the city solvent. But the president and the city still had this kind of tense relationship.
And so the same president would be the ceremonial head of celebrations in this city just months later, in July of 1976, which, well, that seems like it's going to be pretty awkward.
It gets awkward when unpopular presidents visit New York City.
Yes.
And by the way, the entire bicentennial planning had started out a little bit tense many years before, because Congress had created a commission back in 1966 to plan these celebrations, 10 years later.
Yeah.
But for the first 6 years, they just fought over whether or not to hold the events in Philadelphia or in Boston. Not even in New York.
Huh.
No.
Okay.
So they had been gridlocked. And then finally in 1973, a new commission took over and decided that the celebrations, things were tense. So the celebrations should in fact be decentralized and that there should be many, many more of them. Tens of thousands. In fact, 66,000 different celebrations that would be planned at a local level. And that they should focus, on things that were great about the history of the country and also the future that the country held.
So potentially messy, maybe chaotic, but it looks like they were looking for ways to bring the country together.
While tapping into kind of Americana nostalgia.
Yes.
There were projects like the American Freedom Train that toured the country. It was a big hit. And as well as something that maybe you even remember, I'm sure you would have been into it, the Bicentennial Wagon Train Pilgrimage.
Wagon trains.
Wagon
trains. I am starting to see then how a parade of tall ships fits into our story with all these other components then.
Yeah. The centerpiece for New York City's part of the celebration was Operation Sail 1976, or Op Sail 76, which would be this parade of tall ships that would start at the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and then continue into New York Harbor and up the Hudson. And this was an event that was organized and led by Frank Brainard.
Oh, the very Frank who I mentioned earlier in the show had organized Operation Sail for the World's Fair and was a founding member of the South Street Seaport Museum.
The very same Frank. Yes. The 1964 event was the first Operation Sail, and here 12 years later was the second event. So on the 4th of July, 1976, Boston, would have its own events. It would have the Boston Pops performing patriotic numbers. Philadelphia would have all kinds of, parades and spectacle around the Liberty Bell. And DC would have fireworks and other events. But New York would actually have something grander. We would have this huge international parade of sailing vessels that would celebrate the city's and actually the entire country's maritime history.
And, just to bring this point back again into the story, this is more than just a pretty parade of ships, which, it certainly was that. But it's also a way of saying something about how New York's history is forever linked to the harbor and the basis of the city's economy.
That's right. Yes. The ships also represented immigration, which resulted the country's population.
Yeah.
So many had arrived by ship and created the city's and the country's diverse population. So this was really an opportunity to bring New Yorkers together to celebrate their own shared history at a really kind of fraught time.
So can you lay out this whole event for us? July 4th, 1976. Paint this in red, white, and blue, Tom.
Why don't I read from the New York Times?
Yes.
From an article on July 2nd, 1976 that was laying out the festivities to come. Quote, "A vast armada is en route to New York today, bound for a spectacular bicentennial waterborne celebration that will fill the great natural harbor with sailing ships and naval craft. The massing of the ships will reach a climax on Sunday with a parade and a review that is expected to draw huge throngs to the waterfront. The shipping consists of two fleets. One, Operation Sail 76, is a wind-blown fleet of 225 sailing ships making its way down from Newport, Rhode Island, along both the north and south shores of Long Island. It consists of square riggers, barks, barkentines, topsail schooners, ketches, a graceful, silent congregation of vessels under 30 flags. Among them are 16 of the world's 20 largest active sailing vessels and craft that first touched water in the 19th century. The other fleet, the 4th International Naval Review, consists of 52 military ships of 22 nations. The train of gray hulls includes tiny tugs and the 79,000-ton aircraft carrier Forrestal. There are cruisers, destroyers, guided missile ships, and frigates. The gathering of the fleets is a major problem in logistics, not only for the ships, but also for the public."
All I'm going to say is it's hard enough when the World Cup swings into town or the UN General Assembly or one of these other international fests that comes into New York. But this seems like it's almost on another level. So what happened when they all arrived into town at once?
Well, I think it's pretty cool because many of them could be boarded and visited on Saturday, July 3rd, which is really cool. But on that Saturday, the 3rd, the U.S. cruiser Wainwright led the warships to take their places, all the way from the George Washington Bridge all the way down to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Just imagine miles of warships
Yes.
from around the world. And then on Sunday, July 4th, the 16 tall ships sailed in a single line under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge starting at 11 a.m. and slowly and majestically made their way, accompanied by more than 60 Coast Guard craft, past Governor's Island and up the Hudson River. Their masts, by the way, were so tall that they actually couldn't fit under the Brooklyn Bridge, which is why this whole parade was routed up the Hudson. And at the head was the Coast Guard's own ship, the Eagle, which was followed by ships from Norway and Italy, Poland, and on and on.
So a wide range of ships from around the world, but there was also one country here we were in the middle of the Cold War with. We weren't really on the best terms with this country.
Yeah, the Soviet Union sent their giant four-masted Kruzenstern over to help celebrate our 200th birthday. And then that afternoon, the Navy held that official International Naval Review, which was only the fourth in its entire history.
Was President Ford having a good time here? I assume, seems like he probably had a busy schedule that day.
He was incredibly busy that day, but after attending to events in Philadelphia and elsewhere, President Ford was flown onto the deck of the USS Forrestal, that was the host naval ship for the Naval Review, where just after 2 p.m. on Sunday, he rang the ceremonial bell 13 times for the original 13 states, and then he took a helicopter over to the USS Nashville, which was anchored in the Hudson, to watch the sailing ships. And then he headed back to Washington. But millions continued to stay on throughout the day and just jam the shoreline to watch this spectacular maritime display.
So obviously this is the star of the show in New York, right? Operation Sail. This was like the crowning event of the day. It was apparently so comprehensively popular with New Yorkers who are all like racing to all the waterfront areas. You can just imagine just everyone spreading out to watch the ships. But there were actually many vacant streets in Midtown Manhattan, and institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art complained to the press that they had incredibly low attendance numbers for that day.
And we should note that this was long before, the grand parks that we have today that line the West Side,
right.
along the waterfront. There was Battery Park.
There certainly was.
There was Riverside Park, but for much of the West Side in 1976, I mean, the spectators would have just had to battle it out for spaces, a place on one of the old rickety piers, or on top of other buildings or the highway.
In fact, the New York Times reported that, quote, New Yorkers demonstrated their traditional ingenuity and disdain of planning by appearing in spots from which they were specifically excluded. Some managed to find ways to get on the elevated portions of the West Side Highway below 72nd Street. Others perched on cranes, tractor trailers, and tugs tied up at piers, unquote. And the Daily News added, there were enough people watching Operation Sail to make Manhattan's West Side sink a foot into the Hudson River, unquote. I believe that's not actually
hyperbole.
I think that's hyperbole, yes.
So in other words, it was total mayhem, but it was the kind of mayhem that New York loves, right?
Well, I mean, I had to laugh at Battery Park because on this day, it was basically packed from morning to night, completely covered with people. But then, of course, like throughout the rest of the city, in the afternoon and going into the early evening, every other place was flooded with all sorts of interesting events, like various festivals, tours, things like that. In fact, I'll get out my palette of red, white, and blue paints and paint you a picture, Tom, shall I?
Please do.
From the New York Daily News, quote, vendors peddled a wide variety of festive fare. Beside the all-American hot dog, there were corn on the cob, clams on the half shell, sizzling sausages, t-shirts, postcards, balloons, fans, hats, pans, corsages, scarves, sparklers, and toys. One furtive peddler offered bicentennial marijuana. In the downtown throng were visitors from all over the country, indeed from all over the world. And the United Nations was never as united as this shore-to-shore carpet of humanity. Some couples had their faces painted red, white, and blue. A little girl on Wall Street wore a costume made entirely of ticker tape. About 20 men in revolutionary garb recreated Washington's farewell to his troops in front of France's Tavern. A 50-piece U.S. Marine band took a circular route around the southern tip of Manhattan. Thousands of spectators joined the march and turned it into an impromptu parade, and no one ran for cover when a brief downpour began, unquote.
It sounds so earnest and so positive.
I know,
it's wonderful.
doesn't it?
I mean, it sounds like for one day at least, people kind of forgot the other problems that were plaguing the city.
Right. What I find really interesting, though, is just how all of the coverage, both on the local level and national, focused on the ethnic diversity of New York City as a representation of the values of the bicentennial. Today, you may have other cities that are more ethnically or racially diverse than they once were in 1976. But back then, this idea of seeing New York City's melting pot, on screens was actually quite startling to outsiders. Regular folks turning on the television to watch the celebration were seeing Puerto Rican and Dominican flags. They were seeing the faces of people that represented cultures from all over the world here in New York, living here, celebrating the United States.
Right, because these celebrations were being televised nationally on all the networks. And I'm sure that, the city probably seemed pretty exotic, right? For much of the country that was living in far less diverse communities. I mean, imagine flipping on NBC, and seeing these packed streets and people in traditional costumes from Poland or Greece, celebrating America next to people from the Philippines and Pakistan.
That really became the secondary message of this day, especially as most images of the celebration featured some angle, by the way, of the Statue of Liberty, because during those tall ship scenes, you're seeing this throughout the day. And the Statue of Liberty, which by this point represents immigrants, immigration, new arrivals, yearning to breathe free. From the New York Daily News again, quote, "There were Chinese dragons, Turkish belly dancers, Greek and Irish musicians, and Korean martial arts demonstrations. And there was food, pita bread and egg rolls, and you name it. To say nothing of African drums, a Ukrainian fashion show, Serbian storytellers, folk dances of countries from Israel to Paraguay, and a choral recital by a black glee club. But running through it all was a distinctive American flavor," unquote.
The New York Times even highlighted that fact on their front page the following day with the headline, "Ethnic Diversity Adds Spice to the Holiday."
And that article actually lays out the individual street scene here, which is incredible. Quote, "The Turks were at Water and Wall Streets. Down the street at one wall, the Armenians displayed a 10th century illustrated manuscript and dispensed shish kebab."
So with all of that going on, then there were also fireworks, right? That were yet to come that evening at 9 p.m.
Right. So that night, the entire harbor was illuminated with fireworks, with dozens of people climbing the trees in Battery Park and top the light poles in order to see the fireworks. An estimated 2 million people in all just in Lower Manhattan.
Can you imagine
Yes.
the mess, the old ticker tape, the cheap souvenirs that were sort of strewn about? It might have actually looked a little bit like the mess left over from the old evacuation day.
In 1783,
when the British were finally given the boot.
Well, actually, I'm glad you mentioned the British. We're not finished with British visitors in this show. For just 2 days later, July the 6th, who decides to sweep into the country? But Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. They arrived into Philadelphia for a week of events throughout the country, right? This is an interesting twist to this celebration. The following day, on July the 7th, they were greeted at the White House, and there was a banquet dinner that was held in the Rose Garden. And who do you think entertained the Queen that evening?
I'm assuming it was somebody kind of highbrow, opera singer.
Classy. Well, it depends on, on your definition of that, because by the Queen's own request, by the way, she wanted 2 entertainers, and they arrived to perform that evening. It was Bob Hope and Telly Savalas, who was starring at that time as TV's Kojak. Believe it or not, Queen Elizabeth was a huge fan of Kojak. That is truth.
Does not surprise me.
No.
Did she then bring the whole royal entourage up to New York?
Well, Telly and the gang stayed behind. Maybe he went back to work. But the Queen did sail into New York Harbor on a royal yacht on July the 9th. An interesting date for...
July the 9th. So 5 days later.
Right. And an interesting date because, it was 200 years prior to that date when angry patriots tore down the statue of King George in Bowling Green, okay? So an interesting timing to me.
Do you think that she was aware of that coincidence?
I really hope she wasn't. By the way, she did visit Federal Hall, and then she paid a visit to Trinity Church, which, of course, was affiliated with the crown.
Right, and had been Anglican.
Right. The rector of Trinity Church, Robert Parks, I wish I could have been there for this, presented the Queen with 279 peppercorns for back rent.
I hope she brought her grinder. Just put them in here.
Well, some shish kebabs from a couple days ago. Now you got some pepper grinders.
Okay.
All right. Well, anyway, come on. Get this. Today, the spot where she crowned those peppercorns, you can actually stand on that spot where the Queen received that gift. Or there is a plaque on the ground which states, "On this spot stood Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on the occasion of her gracious visit, July the 9th, 1976. His Royal Highness the Prince Philip stood nearby." It also says that on the plaque. There's no arrow, you just have to guess.
Well, so you can literally today stand in the footsteps of Queen Elizabeth.
Yes.
At Trinity Church. We recommend that.
Yes.
It's actually one of the few markers of this particular moment in history in the city. And what did she do for the rest of her day here in New York City?
Well, most notably, and unfortunately, I don't think there are any plaques associated with this, with her big trip uptown, she visited Bloomingdale's department store on Lexington Avenue. Now, the problem with this is that the Queen... I know. She wanted to get a touch of shopping in, okay?
Okay.
The problem is that the Queen, by royal protocol, has to get out of her royal vehicle on the right side, meaning that her limousine had to go up Lexington Avenue.
Which goes down.
Lexington
is
one
way going south. So they rerouted traffic for her?
Yes, it caused quite a mess, believe it or not. But, it was a diplomatic visit to a department store. Their 30-minute, 3-floor tour featured a look at Bloomingdale's Bicentennial period rooms with adaptations of English furniture. Then, while Prince Philip was off looking at pet rocks and adding machines up on, the novelty floor.
Wait.
Pet rocks were popular back in the 70s.
And wait. They had a novelty floor at Bloomingdale's?
All little types. Look, the point is they had to send him away because the Queen was given a private mini fashion show in the company of Donna Karan, Ralph Lauren, and Calvin Klein. Calvin Klein and the Queen were watching this fashion show.
Good grief. Did they take her to Studio 54 afterwards? Just like her own private disco?
Well, yes. By royal custom, she could only disco on the right side of the disco ball. But no, unfortunately, Studio 54 opened the following year in 1977. So she was robbed of that experience.
A shame, a pity, really. But all of this just to underscore that New York City has played a part in celebrating America for as long as there has been in America. Which brings us to this year, to 2026, to the 250th anniversary. What does the city have in store for this big anniversary?
Well, we'll talk to Captain Jonathan Boulware, the CEO of South Street Seaport Museum, to talk about Sail Forth, the Seaport, and more right after this. And we're now joined by Captain Jonathan Boulware, the CEO of the South Street Seaport Museum. Captain, welcome to the Bowery Boys.
Bowery Boys, it's so great to be with you. Thank you.
Yes, it's great to see you.
It's nice to have a real captain on the show. Welcome. We have been discussing how New York has celebrated its centennials and its bicentennials in the past. And we know that you are very much involved in how New York is celebrating this year for the 250th as you are a board member for Sail Forth. So for the listeners who are not familiar with it, what exactly is the Sail Forth celebration?
So Sail Forth in this case is a successor to what some people may remember as Op Sail. There were big events. A big one that people, of a certain age anyway, remember, and a little older than me, that is 1976. And that's when, Walter Cronkite was I think, one of the newscasters, and a really big, high profile at the Bicentennial. There were others in 86 for the Statue of Liberty, 2000 again for the Millennium, and then some smaller ones, 2012 and so forth. But there's also a much longer tradition of harbor celebrations, of river celebrations. I mean, from the meeting of the waters with the opening of the Erie Canal to Dewey's Great White Fleet, there's all kinds of reasons why New Yorkers have convened on their waterways, or why international cohorts have made their way to New York Harbor in celebration. And so this one, at the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of what would become the United States of America, is particularly potent. It's a 250th anniversary. And so I think the number is something like 22 nations are sending sailing ships as well as contemporary naval ships from all over the world. Super exciting.
And in this case, for Sail Forth, this is going to be an incredible procession of tall ships. Can you sort of explain what exactly qualifies as a tall ship? What are these, and what do they symbolize today in 2026?
So let's just start with the term tall ship. It was, if not invented, it was popularized in a Samuel Masefield poem called Sea Fever, one line of which is, "And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by." It's become a sort of shorthand for any kind of sailing vessel. There's an organization called Tall Ships America, which would say that any vessel is a tall ship if it does education under sail, which is distinct from teaching people how to sail. And that's a great way to find an entry point into why do these ships exist. And they're not to teach people how to sail. So let me take a huge step back here and say, these are a particular type of vessels, whether they are modern or historic, that were built for a particular purpose. And that purpose generally was the carrying of cargo. So if you think about the latter part of the 1800s, the steam has come into play. Throughout the 1800s, these ships were calling right here at South Street, for example, calling from all over the world. They're bringing in coal and leaving with manufactured goods. Our own Wavertree, New York's resident tall ship, the centerpiece of our collection out on Pier 16, was actually built to carry jute fiber. She was then a tramp, which was the name for a ship that would take any gig that paid before it was a term for a person of loose morals. So a tramp would, leave with whatever cargo made sense. And so Wavertree, our ship, was 2 years in the jute trade, jute from East India, Bangladesh to the British Isles, and then 22 more years as a tramp. And in that service, she carried all kinds of things: cotton, timber, rice, case oil, which is kerosene in barrels. And in fact, in 1895, we have records of her coming in and dropping off coal from the UK or from the British Isles, and then leaving for Calcutta loaded with case oil.
Wow.
Kerosene. So their purpose technologically, these square rig ships, the big square sails and the yards, which are those things that cross, these are big complicated rigging structures, and the purpose of them was to make deep water passages, long oceanic passages. But what we know about these big sailing ships is that they are absolutely unparalleled leadership platforms.
What does that mean?
Nearly every Navy, and I will say notably not the United States Navy, has a training ship. And that training ship takes plebes or cadets and puts them to sea on a square rig sailing ship. And I would argue, having been a captain of ships like this, mostly smaller ones than you're going to see in the Class A category, but they offer two things. For mariners, they offer an appreciation of the wind and the sea in a very practical way. So if you're taught in a motor-driven ship, you just kind of put the throttle down and you go and, kind of wind and sea direction be damned. And at some level that can work, but it also can really bite you. And what we know is that mariners who are trained with at least a little bit of sailing ship experience have a much more sophisticated way of approaching their work, much in the same way that someone who flies gliders is a better pilot in some cases than those who've only ever done powered flight. The second thing is these ships demand teamwork in a way that a motor-driven ship cannot. There simply aren't enough things to do on a motor-driven ship. A modern motor-driven ship, like these big container ships you see, those might have 20, 25, maybe 30 crew, but there's a lot of automation. And so the building of a team that can actually affect something is much better done aboard a sailing ship. And so what we see is navies around the world and the United States Coast Guard with the Eagle all have continued to believe that that is an essential element in that kind of training. That's why they exist. That's why they are called what they're called.
So from the perspective of July 4th, it's going to be this remarkable event where all of these ships are going to be coming into the harbor. What's really remarkable about this is that this would be pretty much a common sight in New York in the 19th century, especially in the early 19th century, before you had those bridges. This will be a little bit of a blast from the past, don't you think, for New Yorkers?
Yes, although there aren't any New Yorkers old enough to remember it. And the one the one
we act like
distinction
we are sometimes.
old Van Knickerbocker.
That's right. So the one distinction I would make is that the parade itself is a bit of an artifice. During the age of sail, when ships didn't have auxiliary propulsion, they wouldn't have been able to effect a parade like this. It would be too challenging and too much risk. And what would have been visible to New Yorkers in the 19th century is a lower Manhattan in particular, not to mention Brooklyn and other places, where the tallest things visible in nearly any neighborhood were ship masts. Maybe competed with only by church steeples, but there were no buildings above 4, 5, 6 stories, but the ship's masts were towering to 200 feet. And so we have these images of lower Manhattan that are an absolute forest of masts from Corlear's Hook down to the Battery, in some cases shot from the Brooklyn Bridge under construction. So the spectacle will not mirror the 19th century, but it will be resonant.
At least we'll get like a sense of like the grandeur of these gigantic ships and how they once may have looked.
Yes, indeed. And if I may, I think one of the things where, the international sail-in event that we are about to experience, where that overlaps with the museum's mission, and in some ways it's actually why I'm here, is that, how does a ship captain become a museum director? It is really fundamentally, and what I've always cared about is not so much the boats, but about what's happening there, like what's happening between people in these environments. You heard me earlier talking in a very impassioned way about the value of these experiences, what they do to people and do to groups of people in terms of their ability to work together. There's a phrase that's very common in this training world that is ship, shipmate, self. That's the order of priority. The ship comes first because we all depend on it. The shipmate comes next before yourself because you've got to look after your people, and yourself is the last. Look after yourself too, but it's ship, shipmate, self. And it doesn't take a very imaginative person to look at that as an ecological model for the blue marble, how we need to ship, shipmate, self on a global scale. Allegorically, it is a very literal thing about how communities work and how we work as a global society.
And there will be a lot of people working together. I was reading something like 15,000 sailors will be present for the Sail Forth weekend. And, millions of spectators are expected to come to Lower Manhattan and millions more watching on TV. So can you sort of break down the event for us and for our listeners? What can they expect to see? How is this playing out over the days?
Right. So the event itself is the sort of alongside periods, the 3rd to the 8th, and there are going to be berths in Brooklyn at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and on the west side in the north, what we call the North River, the Hudson River, up in way of the cruise ship piers, and there'll be some vessels here between piers 15, 16, and 17 in the East River. Those will be visible, of course, with the ones across the river. The main event is the 4th for the big ship parade, but actually on the 3rd there's a small vessel parade, which will be visible from here in the Seaport. and Pier 16 will be open for viewing that. And that parade begins up at Hellgate, and then that parade will take the ebb tide, or the ebb current down the East River, passing the Seaport. So that's the smaller Class B and C vessels. And then on the 4th itself, the big parade, which is the International Naval Review and the Tall Ships Parade, will begin at the Verrazano Narrows and make its way up past Governor's Island through the Deepwater Channel and up into the North River up to the George Washington Bridge, after which they turn around and then make their way back to their berths, sort of distributed around the city. So some of them to the West Side piers, some of them into New Jersey, some of them over to Brooklyn, and some to Staten Island.
And about how many participating ships will there be on the 4th?
I believe for the sailing ships, it's in the neighborhood of 22 of the Class A's, and then there are a number of other smaller vessels. Yes.
I just find this extraordinary that this is happening at the same time as New York is hosting the World Cup.
I think a lot of people find that extraordinary. I think the mayor finds that extraordinary.
There's going to be so much of the world here in New York, which of course we absolutely love. So turning now, of course, to the South Street Seaport Museum. The museum is also marking this particular moment with a very special exhibition, which just opened, called The Promise of Liberty, Words That Shaped the Nation. This might at first be a surprising exhibition for people who are familiar with the Seaport, but what you've done is gathered a very rare set of documents that relate to the nation's founding. And I think people are going to really be in awe when they see some of these. So can you tell us about this exhibit a little bit, what people can see, what some of the themes are?
Yes. Promise of Liberty, Words That Shape a Nation came to us as a part of this broader Sail Forth initiative. We're working with a curator whose name is Seth Kaller, who has a similar exhibition open right now at the Peoria Riverfront Museum in Illinois, which is a remarkable museum that I actually didn't know existed until we began working on this. And they have a large show called The Promise of Liberty. And we undertook with Seth to gather another set of documents, a separate set of documents that was really New York specific. And the more we dug into this, this has been a whole exploration for me, which I found so nourishing. The more I realized how much of a New York story this actually is. And the more I've learned too about, I haven't read the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence since I was probably in, American history class in whatever grade that was. We have a Constitution that is a part of this exhibition. It's not just any Constitution. It is the first full printing of the Constitution, and the one that was sent from Philadelphia to New York City by overnight stage as a part of the ratification process.
Incredible.
It is one of 14 existing constitutions. But to the show, it's not just the Constitution. It is, in fact, when you enter the show, immediately on the wall there is the Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776. And to the right of it, the 3 mimeographed pages with that sort of purplish ink of Martin Luther King's speech at the 1963 March on Washington, commonly known as the I Have a Dream speech. The Constitution off to the right is sort of the main event because that's the product. But what I find very compelling about this show is the idea that the Declaration and Martin Luther King's speech are the initial conversation. The Declaration is, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And Martin Luther King rightly and obviously observed that the Constitution that would result from it was not an enfranchising document for everyone. But he did recognize that the Constitution and the Declaration were promissory notes to which all Americans shall fall heir. But that's the reason for the show, the promise of liberty. And it was Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's observation that this was a promissory note. So there is also an Emancipation Proclamation signed on behalf of President Abraham Lincoln. There is a suffrage poster. There are calls to arms for Black soldiers to serve in the Revolutionary War. There is the 13th Amendment. There is the Bill of Rights. So I guess what I'm getting around to and what's been really cooking my noodle here is this 2 things. One is this relationship between the Declaration of Independence and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And the second is the Constitution, which needed to be amended right away. That, for all of the folks who would want the constitutional framers to have been wise beyond their time, even they immediately had to amend it to make sure that people weren't imprisoned for simply speaking out. And on through the various other amendments, time after time, including the 13th, which did away with slavery.
What I find, which gives me chills as a history lover, as a history geek, is the fact that you have a copy of the Declaration of Independence. When did New Yorkers and where did New Yorkers first hear those words? They heard them up around the Common Grounds City Hall, right? So like that's very, very close. It's like a 10-minute walk, right?
Yeah.
The Constitution, you also have a copy of the Constitution. It was fully ratified 1789. New York was the federal capital at Federal Hall. Again, like just a few steps away from the Seaport. So it really it shows you how central your museum is making itself, and it's not that hard because you are in the middle of all these important historic moments that happened in New York.
Yeah, that's quite right. I think we are often sort of seen as a museum that has to do with something to do with ships and some sort of niche, bespoke little corner of the special interest world. But in fact, as we were talking about earlier, I think maritime is the common denominator to civilization. New York arose from the sea in 1,000 different ways, practically immigration, language, culture, ideas, and of course trade, which begat Wall Street, et cetera. But to your point, where we are geographically, and one could argue that story that I've just told could be told in many different places in the city. It's best here in just north of what was New Amsterdam. The wall of Wall Street is a little downtown from us. But to your point, we are exactly in the middle between Federal Hall and George Washington's first home, which was the Manhattan Pier of the Brooklyn Bridge, right up in that, what would become
Cherry
that,
Street.
right? So back to kind of why the promise of liberty, words that shape a nation at South Street, because in many respects, it happened here. It began as a Philadelphia story, but it became very much a New York story.
Yeah.
And the Promise of Liberty, the new exhibit, is so timely, and it ties into what we've been talking about on the show today. Then visitors can move on in the museum, through the museum, to Maritime City, which is your main exhibition, which is telling obviously more of the story that you've just shared with us about the importance of maritime history to New York's story. But then that isn't even the entire museum exhibit, because a very important part of the museum is floating outside in the river.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of the Seaport ships that can actually be visited year-round?
The museum has a now somewhat smaller, over the last 10 years, fleet of ships. That was deliberate and very sort of intentional. I mean, many New Yorkers will remember the Peking, which we sent back to Hamburg in 2017. She finally made her way across there, and the Germans spent 34 million euro, and good for them. And we have, with our now somewhat smaller and very sort of focused fleet of ships, we now have a flagship that's super appropriate for the museum, which is the English ship Wavertree. And she's distinct in a really important way. There are museums to the Cutty Sark or to the USS Constitution, ships that have an identity all their own. Wavertree is the opposite of that. It's a pedestrian, simple, heavily built iron ship of the latter days of the Age of Sail, whose initial job was carrying fiber materials from East India to the British Isles, low-level commodity work, and couldn't even make that work. And finally went into, so it was probably bankruptcy or something, and then became a tramp. And then tottered around the globe for 22 years, calling on every continent except Antarctica, carrying mundane cargoes, low-level cargoes. But here's where the interesting resonance with the diversity of New York immediately shows up, is that it's probably British officers because she was a British-owned ship, but the deck crew would have all been from all over the place. They would have been Azorean and Irish and Maori and free black and Swedes, Norwegians of all different types. And it's very tempting to see these things as romantic, and that will show up a lot during Sail Forth. But the fact is, historically, this was a very mundane and frankly dangerous operation. And so Wavertree isn't special because she's the Cutty Sark or the whatever. Rather, she is special because she's the last surviving riveted iron full-rig sailing ship in the world. And the only reason she exists is a series of happy accidents. There was a dismasting. She ended up as a floating warehouse and then a barge. So a very pedestrian vessel who, in all of her dowdiness, stands in for thousands and thousands and thousands of other ships like her that were from here to the Pacific Northwest, to Adelaide, to Oslo, to pick a port. We were connected. And that is the story of New York and of ships like Wavertree.
Yeah.
So in other words, like, everyone will be able to see these marvelous ships when they come in town, but there's already a marvelous ship that they can go to at any time.
Yes,
right?
indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah. So Wavertree is here at Pier 16. The other side of Pier 16 is the lightship Ambrose. Now, lightship is a floating lighthouse. This particular one was the first Ambrose lighthouse. I'm just going to tell you a quick version of the story because it's my single favorite Seaport Museum story. Is
wow.
The Yeah, I don't know.
Then you got to tell it.
So I like it because it's a human story, it's an ambition story, it's a New York story. So the lightship Ambrose is a special vessel because she was actually rooted in a 19th century observed problem. So in the 19th century, New York Harbor, the lower bay, which is very shallow and subject to silting, was getting to be too shallow for the ships that were being built wider and deeper. Technology's improving, ships are getting bigger, and New York Harbor is in danger of not being viable as a shipping port. There's a civil engineer named John Wolfe Ambrose who had immigrated to New York at the age of 10 or 14 in the 19th century. He'd become a civil engineer, and then he did some like Second Avenue L and some of the early subway work. But he lobbied the United States Congress in 1895 that New York needed to dig a deeper entrance channel, or it risked being overtaken by Boston and Norfolk and even New Orleans. And so the Congress allocated $6 million in 1895 for the construction of the channel. It was going to be called the New York Channel. And construction began, and John Ambrose died of typhus before the channel was completed. So Congress's second act was to name the channel for the man who had advocated for it, who had died during its construction. So it became known as the Ambrose Channel. The lightship that we have was the lightship that opened the Ambrose Channel in 1908. The first ship to pass was Lusitania. There's a big celebration. Ambrose drops her anchor out there. Now, just a lightship, of course, is a floating lighthouse that marks the entrance to something or a hazard to stay away from. And so these are on the chart. And so mariners would use, in bringing their ships in, the Ambrose lightship as a target. And they'd pass it and go in the New York Channel and up through the Narrows and into New York Harbor. And if we're talking about, let's say, an immigrant ship, past Ellis Island, West Side Piers, quarantine and, immigration and all that. But during the time that immigration quotas came into play, the Ambrose lightship, our Ambrose lightship, the first Ambrose lightship, Light Vessel 87, which is currently at our pier, was the actual finish line for the immigrant race. It wasn't Ellis. It wasn't the Statue of Liberty, which is ceremonial. It was, did your ship pass the Ambrose lightship ahead of the other ship? And were you, as a Hungarian immigrant, eligible for one of the 100,000 spots or whatever it was in that particular year? And if not, you get turned around and sent back. So literally, 6.5 million people is our estimate during the period of quotas while Ambrose was on. 6.5 million people can count their sort of eligibility for citizenship, for becoming an American, because they passed that Ambrose lightship ahead of whoever else, and they got their spot. Which also means, this is kind of my fun part of this, is in any given group that I'm speaking to, I'll say, well, how many people here have an ancestor who came into New York between 1908 and 1934? 25% of people, reliably, have an ancestor who became an American because of an Ambrose quota. So I think of this as like the Ambrose diaspora, which means there are millions upon millions upon millions of people who maybe don't even know it. And so I think this is the biggest name and light story never told. That an Irish immigrant kid comes in and gets his name to be synonymous with coming to America.
Again, it's maritime history and it's New York history and it's American history all wrapped up in one floating vessel.
And I'll add a little icing on that cake. Is I have a friend whose name is Thomas Ambrose, and he'd probably listen to this podcast and be like, "How dare you!" We were standing on the top of one of these museum buildings a bunch of years ago, and he kind of casually said to me, "I'm named after that lightship."
Really?
He said his ancestor, great, whatever it was, knew that in coming into the Ellis Island that it was likely that his name would be changed to something other than his given name. And so he proactively chose the name Ambrose for having crossed the Ambrose lightship. And so when he got there, he said, "My last name is this, but I'd like to be Ambrose." And so his family name is now Ambrose. So I have a friend who's named for a lightship that's named for a man who used to be a poor Irish immigrant and kid and whose name is synonymous with liberty.
I mean, not only is that a remarkable story, but a remarkable coincidence, you must admit, that someone that happens to have that story.
I had known him for 15 years before I heard the story.
One of the aspects of the bicentennial that we were talking about is just how it was celebrated at a tricky time. It was a tricky time. For the U.S., it was a tricky time for the city. I mean, in 1976, the city was broke, and it was also divided in so many ways.
That's right. Can
you talk about how Operation Sail overcame that, or Also, do you see any kind of parallel to where the country is right now and what this event could promise or benefits it could bring to our current situation?
Yeah, I think you're asking a really smart question, and it is true that the bicentennial was celebrated during a very fractious time, and as you point out, a very, very challenging time for the city. I mean, even in my own local sphere here, that was a devastating time for the Seaport Museum, as it was for many other cultural institutions in that time. So I think that for me, the Sail 4250 and the big international review reminds us of our place in the world, is my hope. I think we need less reminding of that here in New York than other large governing cities in the U.S. might need. But I think that there is hope in pulling together and seeing common humanity. I also will say that I think our exhibition, I think it's so potent to be in the presence of and actually reading and consuming and thinking about these documents that were written 250 years ago to create a system of government that, while it had historical analogs, had never been created before, and that it's been an experiment right along. It is under strain right now, make no mistake. I did not expect that when we put forth this exhibition and pulled out the grievances of against the king and the Declaration, that they would be so, many of them were so current events-y. Nor did I expect that I would be taking on something that was potentially provocative. The words that we've pulled forth that are provocative now are 250 years old. And yet here we are. And so my comment to you, Tom, is that I think there is hope, and I think there is an opportunity for these large-scale events to be transformative, and I hope very much that that's what we will see.
Well, to learn more about this year's festivities, head to sailforth.org and, of course, visit the museum's website at seaportmuseum.org. And you can visit the museum Wednesdays through Sundays from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. at 12 Fulton Street, among other locations. We want to thank you so much, Captain Jonathan Boulware, for joining us today on the Bowery Boys.
Delighted to be with you. Thank you for having me.
We want to thank Captain Jonathan Boulware for joining us on the Bowery Boys. The latest exhibition at the South Street Seaport Museum is called The Promise of Liberty, Words That Shape the Nation.
Please visit our website, BoweryBoysHistory.com. Greg, I don't even think that we officially revealed this yet on the show, but we have revamped the entire podcast website.
Yes.
So now you can go over to BoweryBoysHistory.com and search easily through our 19-year catalog of podcasts. And it's easier than ever before. Simply click on Episode Finder, a link at the top, and you can search through nearly 500 episodes. And we also have a section called Collections, where you can find episodes by different topics, from different eras to boroughs to themes. You can even book a Bowery Boys walk right there directly on the website.
I mean, that's one of my favorite features. It's so incredible. That's down at the bottom. And by the way, speaking of, if we have put you in a patriotic mood today, maybe recommend Billy Nemitz's American Revolutionary Tour from Bowery Boys Walks. That tour is running through the entire summer.
Yes.
And it covers spies, battles, and other old sites throughout the financial district.
And also, we want to mention that the Gilded Gentleman, Carl Raymond, is hosting a very special bus trip up to the Lockwood Matthews Mansion on July 25th, 2026. And there are still a few seats left on the bus. So to get your tickets for those tours and so many others, head over to BoweryBoysWalks.com.
And finally, today's show is edited and produced by Kieran Gannon.
Thanks, Kieran.
So thank you all very much for listening.
Or watching us on YouTube.
Yes, we're there as well. We're everywhere you want to be this summer. Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.
See you real soon.